is Jim Hamilton. I'm an advisor to the Department of Energy's consent-based siting team, and my role today is to help us all have an open and productive conversation. To start off, we have a few housekeeping issues to go over, and I'll run through those now. First off, from a safety perspective, we have 6 emergency exits in this building, or in this room. 2 behind me, 2 to your left, and 2 from where you came in. You should all have an information packet that you received when you checked in. It looks like this. If you don't have one, raise your hand and we'll get you one. All right. The packet contains a copy of today's agenda, speaker biographies, contact sheet for further information, content of the informational posters you see here beside you, or outside in the back, sorry. Sample themes and questions for the small group discussions, and I'll explain more about that later. An information booklet the department published about waste management and consent-based siting, and an evaluation form. For those on the webinar, this information is also on the department's website. The department would very much like to hear from you as to the design and implementation of the consent-based siting program for nuclear waste management facilities. And to that end, we've designed today's agenda as follows. Opening remarks by Governor Perdue. We'll then hear from Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Nuclear Energy, John Kotek, followed by 4 very excellent panel members who will share their thoughts and perspectives, a question and answer session lasting 45 minutes for the panel, and then a quick break. Following the break, we'll have a small group discussions to dig more deeply into the issues around consent-based siting you heard this afternoon, and we encourage your participation in those discussions. Following that, there will be a report-out session from those small group discussions, and then we'll have a public comment period and closing remarks. This public meeting is being streamed live, and a copy of this meeting, a copy of this stream, along with a meeting transcript and a report summarizing your input, will be on the department's website shortly. We hope to cover a good deal of ground today, and we look forward to your collective interest and participation. Again, thank you all very much for being here, either remotely or in person. And I want to turn it over now to Governor Perdue for his opening remarks. Governor Perdue.
Thank you, Jim. I may note I'm former Governor Perdue. I served from 2003 to 2011, so I'm not responsible for anything now. So I would like to welcome you all to the After the Masters party today. And we are a proud host, as you know, of the Augusta National here in Georgia, and the Masters, one of the best tournaments, golf tournaments there are, although tragic as it was for one young man yesterday afternoon. But welcome. We are glad that you're here. Our purpose here today is to invite you all to inform the Department of Energy, the sponsor of this event, over what the process should look like really regarding what to do with our nuclear waste in this nation. Now, I come not really as a former governor, but my main claim to fame in this area, because I know virtually nothing about nuclear waste. And sad to say, many of the people who will be making decisions about this know very little about nuclear waste. But the fact is, I come with my main claim to fame as a former chairman of Planning and Zoning Commission in Houston County in Middle Georgia, which was a very transitioning county from agrarian time for 10 years chairing that committee. What I learned from that was probably the best educational lesson I could learn for representative government. I learned how passionate people are about that great constitutional right of personal property. And I also learned how passionate people are about their communities and what happens in their communities. So I view this really issue, Secretary Kotek, as really a large planning and zoning decision of how you design the process whereby what we decide, what all of us decide to do with the nuclear waste that is scattered among the United States of America. If you've ever been to a Planning and Zoning Committee, you know that the not in my backyard is very prevalent, whether it's a landfill, whether it's a new subdivision, or whether it's a new Walmart. Many people have disagreements about that. How do you accept those disagreements in a very respectful way, allowing people to express their opinions and reach a consensus for the public good is really what this group is about. I applaud the Department of Energy, Secretary Moniz and Secretary Kotek regarding their efforts to hear from you and to learn from you regarding what you think should be a part of the process of making these very decisions. We're not here to discuss or debate the relevance or the importance or the right or wrongness of nuclear energy and nuclear waste. You all in this room know that it's already here. And I'm not willing, as a citizen with 14 grandchildren, to kick the can down the road to the next and the next and the next generation. I believe it's up to us to resolve this and to do it in a way that's respectful, that it's trusting, and that it's enduring and sustainable. We don't need a short-term political decision that will be reversed or negated with the next election. We've got to have a common sense, enduring solution. That's built on, I believe, on consensus. One of the words used for this meeting, on consensus. You can have laws. We had planning and zoning laws. We had land use plans, but it took people, flesh and blood, hearing out the respectful disagreements among citizens, all good citizens, all fine people with differing opinions about particular issues, to resolve that. And that's what brings us together to here today. In the United States of America today, there's a lot of paralysis of decision making. And this is a tough issue. There's no doubt about it. It's a sort of a zero tolerance issue. But the people in this room, as well as those other meetings across the country, I think can contribute to a guide and a process that can be transparent, that can be trustworthy, and it can be sustainable, enduring, if we proceed with the right guiding principles. How did I get involved in this from planning and zoning through the governor's office? I'm a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington. That's a group of people that came together with Senate majority leaders on both sides, trying to have respectful dialogue and discourse about some of the toughest, most intransigent problems of the day. And I was wonkish enough, as Ken will tell you, about energy and telecommunications and those kind of things, just an intellectual curiosity about what do we do about tough issues that are not politically sexy. This may be a politically explosive, if you'll use the pun, but not sexy issue. And frankly, when I was asked to engage in the Nuclear Waste Council part of the Bipartisan Policy Center, I agreed to do that because somebody's got to do it. And former Congressman Norm Dix and I are chairing a Nuclear Waste Council. We recently had the opportunity to travel to an area of the United States that knows a lot about this issue, knew a lot more than I did, and had done their due diligence. That's southeastern New Mexico and West Texas, Andrews County and Lee County in New Mexico, where a uranium enrichment facility is located, as well as a storage facility, WCS, is located. And I learned a lot from those citizens there who had done their homework, and they based their opinion and their decision over transparent, honest communication and discussion, assessing the risk and rewards of what these type of facilities would bring. Today, I want to encourage you to speak respectfully. While many of you may come with hard opinions about this issue, that's okay. Passionate opinions about this issue. Please don't demonize the person who doesn't come with those same discussions. Listen and learn, and as we learn together, I'm confident the Department of Energy will hear some guiding principles to guide them as a responsible party in what do we do in dealing with this nuclear spent fuel, defense-related nuclear waste located throughout the country. And I'm hopeful for a productive session today. We're glad to have you in our capital city. I hope you'll enjoy the day, spend a lot of time here, spend a lot of money here, and have a great session. Thank you all for allowing me to welcome you here today. Tripping hazard there, sorry.
Thank you, Governor. And now I want to introduce John Kotek, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Nuclear Energy.
Great. Thanks very much, Jim. For starters, we're going to open the meeting actually with a video that Secretary Moniz recorded that I think we have ready to go. Am I right about that? Is that a no? Well, it's coming. All right. Bear with us. We're halfway there. We're going to give it one more shot, and if this doesn't work, I'll just kick it off.
The meeting you are part of today marks an important step toward resolving a challenge that I've been working on for many years. Back in 2010, before I became Secretary of Energy, President Obama...
Why do these things work well before the meeting starts, but they don't ever work well? All right, I tell you what. Thank you, Secretary Moniz. All right. With that auspicious start, let's talk about nuclear waste. So my name is John Kotek. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy in the Department of Energy. For those of you who don't know, the Department of Energy is the federal agency that has been charged with providing for the final disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste. We in DOE actually do most of our work through a series of system of national laboratories located throughout the country, including the Savannah River National Lab, which is just a couple hours from here. Some of you may be familiar with. We are here today because we want to find a sustainable, durable, safe, long-term solution for the storage and disposal of spent fuel and high-level nuclear waste. We, as the Department of Energy, are committed to developing a process to site waste management facilities collaboratively with, again, states, tribes, local governments, other stakeholders. What we're doing here today is we're seeking your help. Right? We're at the beginning of a process to identify sites. We're not out looking for sites right now. What we're doing is we're trying to put together a process, and we want your input in the development of a consent-based siting process that's fair and that's reflective of your input. So really, at the end of the day, we've had a long-standing challenge in the United States associated with finding a safe long-term solution for the disposal of spent fuel and high-level wastes. We want to hear your values, your perspectives, to help inform our process going forward. I'm going to assume this is going to work. There we go. All right, so how did we get here? Well, just a brief overview. We've used nuclear technology in a variety of ways in the United States. We've used it for power production. We've used it for national defense activities. We've used it for research activities. On the commercial side, we've been using nuclear power to generate electricity for about 60 years. Nuclear provides just shy of 20% of the electricity used in the United States. Here in the Southeast, it's more like 25%. In the United States, 99 nuclear reactors in 30 states are used to produce electricity. They also produce about 2,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel each year, which need to be stored and ultimately disposed of safely for the long term. All right. Just briefly speaking, the nuclear fuel, and for those of you who were here earlier, you saw we had a mock-up of nuclear fuel pellets and assemblies outside. That fuel is used in a nuclear reactor to generate heat. I won't go through the details, but if you want to talk about later, more than happy to. That heat is used to boil water, generate steam, generate electricity. The fuel itself all right, that we're talking about dealing with is cast in solid pellets like the one you see over here on the right, put into long steel tubes we call cladding, put into these fuel assemblies. A commercial nuclear reactor, depending on the design, will have between 200 and 500 of these assemblies in the reactor. They'll stay in the reactor for about 5 years, right, generating electricity. When they're done, they need to be stored. When the reactor comes out of the, or when the fuel comes out of the reactor, it needs to be stored. It's very physically and radioactively hot when it comes out of the reactor, and so first we put it into wet storage into a pool. All right, typically stays there for at least 5 years. As the pools fill up at reactor sites around the country, more and more of the older fuel is being put into dry storage, like these casks you see here on the right. Roughly speaking, about 2/3 of the fuel in storage at commercial reactors around the country is in wet storage in these pools. About 1/3 is in dry storage. But as each year goes by, a higher and higher percentage of that material goes into dry storage. Okay. We've also, as I mentioned earlier, have to provide for the safe disposal of wastes arising from defense and other DOE activities. You had a range of activities here. The Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, for example, generates nuclear waste. Some of you probably know that aircraft carriers and submarines in the U.S. use nuclear reactors, so we need to provide for the disposal of that material. Research and production reactors from production of the nuclear deterrent or for medical isotopes or for other applications have generated large quantities of waste, as have, of course, the weapons program itself. So we've got a variety of waste forms there that we need to deal with. We've got calcine waste, which is waste from reprocessing and from production activity that happened in Idaho, which is where I live. We've got spent fuel that just comes out of a reactor that is being packaged, or high-level wastes that are being solidified that are being packaged that will go into storage and ultimately needs to be disposed of. And this thing you see down the bottom is vitrified glass waste. Again, a lot of the high-level waste, like the waste generated at the Savannah River site as well as the Hanford site, being vitrified, being immobilized in a glass form, again, for storage and ultimately needing to be disposed. Regardless of what we do in terms of the storage configuration for all this material, ultimately we need a disposal capability. And worldwide, the scientifically preferred method for dealing with the stuff over the long term is deep geologic disposal in a mined repository, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. All right. So again, we've got this 75,000 or so metric tons of spent fuel. We've got about 12 million cubic feet of solids, liquid sludges from defense primarily activities that need to be managed and disposed. Where is this stuff? It's in most of the states in the United States. You can see here from the map whether it's commercial nuclear reactors, either operating ones in green or ones that have been shut down in red, or defense waste sites or other DOE managed waste sites. We've got spent fuel and high-level waste in storage around the country needing to be ultimately disposed. As we think about moving forward with a system that includes both storage and disposal for waste, particularly compelling is the fact that we've got 14 shutdown power reactor sites around the country where reactor operated, spent fuel was generated, the fuel is still in storage on site, in some cases in pool storage, but more and more in dry storage. And in several cases, the reactor's gone, the turbine hall's gone, the administration building's gone, everything's gone except for the spent fuel. So as we move forward, clearing out these shutdown plant sites and consolidating fuel into a storage facility, ultimately leading up to repository disposal, is one of the aspects of the program you'll hear us talking about here going forward. So why act now, right? I mean, we've been generating this waste for decades. We do get asked this question. I know many of the folks from this room from my service as staff director from the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which looked at this issue and issued a report a little over 4 years ago. A number of reasons for moving forward now. This waste has been produced generating electricity for our benefit and a nuclear deterrent for our benefit. And I know there are folks in this, some folks in this room are strong supporters of the use of nuclear technology, others who are not. Regardless of how you feel about it, this material exists. Even if you shut down all the commercial nuclear power plants today, you'd have something like 85,000 metric tons of waste that need to be dealt with. We need to provide for a solution for this material. The taxpayer liabilities associated with dealing with this material are large and are growing. The government has already paid out $4.5 billion in settlements due to the government's inability to start receiving this waste as it was supposed to in 1998, as called for in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Those liabilities are projected to run into the tens of billions of dollars. Funding to pay for the disposal of the commercial fuel has already been collected from ratepayers. Just about everybody in this room, I would venture to guess, has paid something into the Nuclear Waste Fund by virtue of the fact that there was a 1/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour charge on nuclear generated electricity set aside to pay for disposal of this waste, which was collected up until 2013. The government's entered into agreements with states to move this material out of those states. So, lots of reasons to move forward, not the least of which is we need to find a safe, sustainable storage and disposal solution for this material now. We've got the technology, we've got the resources to do it, and we shouldn't leave the problem to future generations. All right, kind of building on what the governor said earlier. Okay, all right. So how did we get to our approach for solving this problem? Well, as I mentioned, we have a long history of waste management efforts in the U.S. This is a bit of an eye chart. I think we have this on posters outside if anyone's interested in getting a brief overview of the history here. I won't go through all of it, but starting in the 50s, the government was commissioning studies looking at what to do with this material. As you go through time, several attempts have been made to site facilities, all really using a top-down, sort of government-driven, Washington, D.C. driven approach, trying to find locations in particular states to store or dispose this stuff. They've all not worked out for various reasons. So here we are today trying to develop a process that can lead to a durable solution for the management of this material, which is where we are now. International experience supports the idea that a consent-based process to siting new nuclear waste management facilities is the way to go. I'll point out that our colleagues in Finland are the furthest along. They've got a site selected, approved by their regulator, and they're about to enter into construction for their repository for commercial fuel. The Swedes are a little bit further behind. They've got a site chosen, the French as well, and the Canadians have embarked on a consent-based siting process through which they received expressions of interest from more than 20 communities who were interested in potentially hosting a repository. So we're seeing that around the world, countries that have employed a consent-based siting process have had success in identifying communities that are willing to become willing and informed hosts for such a facility. Here in the U.S., what we're doing is we're implementing the administration strategy, which was issued in 2013. That strategy builds on the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which were issued back in 2012. And what the strategy envisions is an integrated system for nuclear waste management. And let me walk you through what that looks like. We're looking to develop a system that consists of one or more facilities for storage of spent fuel and potentially high-level wastes, although clearing out the shutdown plant sites of their spent commercial fuel is the main driver at the outset. We also envision development of repositories. At the end of the day, you need one or more deep-mined geologic repositories. The WIP facility in southeast New Mexico, again, is an example of a deep mine geologic repository. That's for disposal of a different type of waste. And then, of course, we need a transportation system that can allow us to safely move materials from where they're currently stored to disposal or to storage and ultimately to disposal. Those disposal facilities could be for commercial fuel. Also, last year, the President issued a finding that allows us in DOE to investigate the development of a standalone facility for disposal of some of the defense waste inventory that we have. So as we get out and start implementing a consent-based process, we'll be talking to communities, states, tribes about their interest in hosting one or more of the types of facilities that we've laid out here. Okay. And as we go forward, I talked about transportation. That will be a very important part of what we do. Obviously, moving this material safely, again, to storage facilities and then to disposal facilities is of the utmost importance. We, of course, move materials like this today, and an essential component of doing that safely is working extensively with states and with tribal governments to ensure that they've got the training and they've got the emergency preparedness, they've got the resources necessary to support the safe transport of this material. And so while consent-based siting doesn't apply to the transportation system, the need to move this material points to the need to work very effectively with states and tribes to ensure safe transport of the material. As I mentioned earlier, ultimately what we're leading to is a deep geologic repository, just a cartoon of what something, a disposal facility might look like. You could see a ramp system here like they're envisioning in Europe, or you could see it in an elevator shaft system like they have down in WIP to bring waste down to the disposal level. But talking about finding a geology that is suitable for isolating this material from people in the environment for many thousands of years. Okay. All right, so where do we go from here? Again, we're here today to listen to you all, to get your input. All right, we're not at the stage where we're out looking for locations. This is really about designing a process. Okay, and so we want to hear from local governments. We want to hear from communities, states, tribes, other interested parties about what this process should look like so that we can ultimately get to a system that ensures safe and secure operations, that gains trust among stakeholders, and that adapts its operations and its approach based on lessons learned. Okay? So what we intend to do in the near term is engage in these 3 steps. We want to start, like here today, engaging with the public and interested parties on the elements of consent-based siting process. We're going to use the input we receive from you all, from webinars, other meetings that we have, from written comment in response to the Federal Register notice we issued, to design a consent-based siting process that will serve as a flexible framework for engaging with potential host communities. And we're going to use that, the resulting consent-based siting process to work with potential hosts. So again, here today, the most valuable thing we can get out of this is get your thoughtful input to these 5 questions. And that, so you'll hear from me, we'll hear from the panelists, a little food for thought for the discussions. We're then going to break up into smaller groups for facilitated sessions so we can hear your thoughts on what you think are the most important takeaways for us as we go off and design a process. As I mentioned earlier, we've got several ways in which we're going to be receiving input. This meeting is just one of several channels through which we hope to receive input. The invitation for public comment, as I mentioned in the Federal Register, we plan on doing a public webinar, maybe conference calls through the spring and summer, and then also meetings with stakeholders as requested. That will result in us issuing a summary of the input that we've received, and will also allow us to draft a consent-based siting process. We've heard as we've gone that it's also going to be important for communities, states, tribes to understand kind of what's the target, all right, what are we looking for. So we also intend later this year to issue preliminary siting considerations to provide a baseline for these siting discussions so communities know whether they might have the type of site that might meet our needs. We're also looking at hopefully providing a funding opportunity so that states, tribes, local governments, others can apply for funds so that they can have the resources to investigate these issues on their own and come to their own conclusions about whether they might be willing to serve as a host. I should say that we've requested $25 million in the fiscal 17 budget that's currently before Congress. Both of the appropriations committees, the Energy and Water Appropriations Committees that act on our budget requests, they're planning on meeting later this week. So maybe by the end of this week we'll at least have some sense as to how the appropriators have reacted to that request. And then, as I mentioned earlier, ultimately, step 3, getting engaged with communities, maybe tribal governments to the extent they want to get involved in states as to who might want to serve as a willing and informed host, who's interested in learning more. So we ask that you get involved. Thank you all for being here today. If after today you participate in today's session, there are other things you want to offer up to us, send us an email, visit our website, but keep the good ideas coming. Really appreciate your time and attention, and look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We now have the privilege of hearing from 4 panelists who will bring their rich perspective to this issue. Each of them will offer their own thoughts on the siting challenge, and we'll proceed in alphabetical order. First, we'll have Professor Michael Elliott from Georgia Tech, followed by Mindy Goldstein from Emory, then Commissioner Bubba McDonald from the Georgia Public Service Commission. We wrap up with Rick McLeod from Savannah River. I'm not going to read their bios. It's all in your information packet, but we're all grateful to be able to hear from them today. So, without further ado, Professor Michael Elliott.
We're going to set the time. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Michael Elliott. I'm a faculty member at Georgia Tech, and my work is of 2 kinds. One is that I do what's called dispute systems design. I design systems for intervening into public disputes, and the second is I actually do interventions. I'm a mediator. So the perspective I'm coming at as somebody who's been working in the field of toxics and hazardous waste for a long time, working in communities and with companies, with sources of waste, as well as and trying to bring those parties together. One of the things that's very striking about that experience, and we've been through that experience for the last 20 or so years trying to figure out how to get the issues of toxics and the issues of communities to be able to work together. Some of the experiences that we have from that is, first of all, that when you enter into a community, there are 3 fundamental kinds of problems that you're always going to face. The first is that you're trying to site a facility in the presence of uncertainty, in the presence of risk. And the ways in which people are going to engage with those questions of risk and uncertainty are going to vary depending upon their particular perspective within the community. The second is that the stakes of these, the ways in which people conceive of the problem, is generally pretty high, that they do not think of these things as small issues, but rather issues that could potentially threaten their communities in fundamental ways, or potentially could provide certain kinds of advantages depending upon how these things are structured. And the third is that what we call framing, and that is that when you enter into a community, people are going to come at this issue from very different kinds of perspectives. And those perspectives are going to shape the way that they make sense of the challenge that they face. They're going to, for instance, shape the way that they conceive of issues like risk. So that, for instance, people who have a more professional, kind of engineering-oriented perspective, an expert perspective around questions of risk, tend to focus on things like expected outcomes. They tend to focus on the individuals within the community and how many of them are at threat. They look at risk paths and things like that, whereas many people in the community tend to focus on things like variability of outcomes, the extreme outcomes, the potential for extreme outcomes, the kind of impacts on community as a whole, and the fact that there's uncertainty in the system itself. So in this, the kinds of exchange that you're looking for in order to produce consent-based decision processes has to have a number of different characteristics. Some of those characteristics are fairly self-evident in the sense that it has to be evaluative in its format, in the sense that it's searching for truth, but it has to be evaluative in a format in which the ways of knowing are actually different, that people come at this not just from the point of view of expertise, but also from experience, and that experience is a valid part of the process of seeking truth in any particular point. Has to do with normative kinds of issues. The issues of fairness have already been mentioned, but there are other kinds of normative issues about, for instance, the relationship between storage of waste and production of waste, which Many people would like to separate completely, but the experience in hazardous waste is that those two issues were very difficult to separate. That as long as the issue was still conceived of as whatever waste comes in we're going to store, that there was huge amounts of opposition to this. And it was only when the communities got a sense that they could actually reduce the amount of waste, that it was a process not just of storing waste, but managing it in a kind of a fuller sense, were they willing to, in fact, grapple with those. So the issue of normative functions are important. The issues of a kind of expressive and subjective truthfulness, the notions that, in fact, it's not just about an objective truth, but how one enters into that. The fact that it involves openness and that that's an interactional kind of process. And what I mean by that is not just openness to the solution of this particular piece of the puzzle, but in a sense that since this piece of the puzzle, the disposal, is tied to all the other parts of the puzzle, to some degree, the issue of what the boundary of this is an issue which has to be addressed also in a consent process. And that there will be real tensions around what the boundaries of the issue actually is and how this should be approached. We get then to the question of designs of processes, and there are fundamentally two kinds of processes that are consent-based that you can imagine. One of them is stakeholder-based, the idea that, in fact, what you look for is all of the individuals, the types of individuals who are affected by the disposal issue, and you try to, in fact, put together a process in which you bring together very good representatives of those perspectives and try to work it out amongst a selected group of people who represent those perspectives. And the second is to try to do it in a way that is actually quite representative of the communities in which you are engaging. And those representative processes are, by their very nature, require many more people to be involved, many people who have less expertise and less involvement than you would find if, in fact, you do a stakeholder-based. And the issue will be, how do you balance those? At some level, you have to, for an issue like this, you have to have both of those, because one of them, in fact, kind of works across a community, requires, for instance, that you seek out people who aren't normally involved in these kinds of issues and engage those kinds of individuals in these kinds of processes, which then only increases the issues that have to do with how we frame it and how we make sense of it. And the other of which, of course, involves the people who have been involved over a long period of time, and some of whom, where these issues have become deeply embedded in kinds of the stylistic ways in which we've debated. So that ultimately is a question of who we're involved, how we design it, but it has very clear kinds of perspectives of dealing with risk, dealing with framing, dealing with stakes, and dealing with fact-finding. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mindy Goldstein. I'm a faculty member at Emory Law School and director of the Turner Environmental Law Clinic. The clinic is a public interest law firm housed within Emory Law School and staffed primarily with the help of law students. Each year, we provide about 4,000 hours of pro bono legal assistance to environmental nonprofit organizations. Some of this work has been representing organizations concerned with the environmental and safety risks associated with the generation, storage, and disposal of spent nuclear fuel. While this work has certainly informed my views, I want to start by saying the views I express today are my own. They're not necessarily the views of Emory University or of my clients. And I realize that was a really lawyerly way to start any talk, and I'll try not to play law professor throughout the rest of this, but I just wanted to get started with that. And while I'm disclaiming things, I'm also going to be reading from my notes a little bit. That's because I think the details are important in this conversation, and I want to make sure that I get them right. So I think we're sitting here today because citing a nuclear waste repository is difficult. And nuclear waste has the capacity to outlast human civilizations and the potential to devastate public health. And because of this, we've been unsuccessful in the past in citing nuclear waste repositories. I'd argue that the common denominator in many of these failures is that, one, the federal government has failed to obtain consent from the host communities. And two, these communities have refused to be host facilities solely on the federal government's terms. I think we need to avoid repeating history and take these difficulties into account and learn from our past mistakes. resist the urge to rush, and create a process that gives host communities power, control, and a means to meaningfully consent. I'm going to walk through what I think all of those are in just a second. Before I do, I think there's two underlying principles that guide all of this. I believe John covered them, but just to reiterate, one is that spent nuclear fuel must ultimately be disposed of in a permanent geologic repository. And two, we need to ensure that any interim or temporary storage solution does not become a permanent one. So in my opinion, the only way to do this is to link the site selection process for a repository with the selection process for a repository. So when I'm talking about consent, it really does cover both. So with that, I will get started. How can we avoid the mistakes of the past, and how can we ensure that host communities have power, control, and the means to meaningfully consent to hosting a repository? I believe that this requires consent to be marked by three characteristics. Consent must be informed, it must be voluntary, and consent requires control. I'm going to focus on the third one, but briefly touch on the first two. Consent must be informed. What that means is that before selecting a site or before seeking consent, we must establish clear technical criteria. Clear standards for what site screening requires, clear standards for repository development, and clear standards for radiation and environmental protection. Communities must know what they're consenting to before they can consent. This means consent will take time. It will take time to develop all of these standards, and we must resist the urge to rush the process because of outside pressures. We must fully develop a plan, or else we'll end up right back here again in not too long. The second thing is consent must be voluntary. And I think that circles back a little bit to the informed consent that I was talking about. But two things I'd like to point out is that consent should not be bought. There is a fine line between incentives and coerced consent. We need to acknowledge that line and walk it carefully. At a bare minimum, I think that having clear standards in place before we seek consent will help avoid any conflicts. What we don't want is communities to feel pressure to consent because of any outside concerns. A second thing is consent should be durable. And what I mean by that is this process is going to take time, and there should be ways out, at least in the beginning. We need to set a clear path for what consent means, when host communities can withdraw, and when they're bound by their commitment so that everyone knows what they're going into moving forward. But the bulk of my suggestions today concern control and the ability to enforce. I would say states must have regulatory oversight authority and authority over operational limits. Allowances for any recipient state to have such authority have been missing from previous efforts to site nuclear waste repositories. And I think that these missing things have been in part why these repository sightings have failed. States refuse to host facilities solely on the federal government's terms. So how do we give states power to regulate? This, like many other suggestions that I'm guessing you'll hear today, will require a change in our laws. Current federal law, specifically the Atomic Energy Act, preempts almost all forms of state regulation over high-level radioactive waste facilities in general and radioactive nuclides in total. That means states that consent to allowing a storage or disposal site are close to powerless to do anything if those sites fail, causing harm to their members of their community. It's up to the federal government to act. For a state to meaningfully consent, I think this needs to change, because consent requires the ability to ensure that what you've consented to is what actually happens. And what most communities are consenting to is safe storage and disposal facilities. So to this end, just quickly, what I would argue is that the Atomic Energy Act we need to remove the exemptions for radionuclide government to just the federal government, and amend the Atomic Energy Act to allow EPA and states to have authority. This authority should probably come under RCRA and the Clean Water Act. This would require a bit of work. It's not an easy fix, but I think it's something that must happen in order for states to meaningfully consent. And I'm happy to talk later about how that was done at the WIT facility and in other examples across nuclear waste storage. Quickly, I know I'm almost out of time. Consent requires a little bit more than all of this. I've been talking for the most part about states consenting, but of course states aren't the only ones who need to consent. We need to consider other communities, local governments, and in areas where we are crossing geopolitical lines or boundaries, we need to look at interstate agreements to kind of collectively come to terms with some of this stuff. So I will talk about all of this later with any of y'all. Thank you.
John, I apologize. That's about what we've gotten for many years lip service. Having been raised in Georgia here in the South, I was taught at an early age to be a positive, be a Southern gentleman. So I'll open these remarks with saying thank you for your presence. We're here to discuss some very important issues, and thank you for bearing with me. I know that we are kind of in the pecking order where we are because when the governor spoke and John spoke, the clock wasn't running. The clock has started running when the panelists get up here to say a few remarks. But I had black hair when this discussion started many years ago, and when we started talking about the disposable nuclear waste. And really, down to the line, it's time for the Department of Energy and Congress to bring closure to this. In light of the recent closings of several nuclear plants, there is no repository that is set forth to receive the contracts that have already been written. Georgia ratepayers have invested over $1.3 billion in the Nuclear Waste Fund. And it's only right that our constituents should get an annual report of how much is in that fund and how much interest has accrued in that fund, so that when there is a time down the road, and probably won't have any here at that time, but when something does happen, that we'll be able to recognize it in a very fiscal manner as we do in most issues. We're in the process in Georgia here building 2 new nuclear plants, 1,100 megawatt plants. We've got to know where we're going down the road better than where we've come from. And we've got faith and we've got confidence that this is going to happen. The only thing I want it to happen is before either the people of Georgia retire me or I retire myself in 2020. But with that said, in business, as a business person all my adult life, I've always been my policy to live up to any contract, whether it was a home mortgage or a business loan or a marriage contract, to live up to what I signed for. And that's all I ask of Congress and the Department of Energy. Live up to your contract that you signed for, so that we will know, we'll have an understanding, we'll have a road of direction from a consent base, we'll have the direction of positive policy of what we can make a foundation to build from. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission noted in 2002 that it determined that Yucca Mountain could be used for a nuclear disposal project. However, the NRC staff did not recommend issuing construction authorization because of some of the outstanding issues. What better reason to move forward with consent-based siting than that? Let's get started with something. It's also needed to be said that any site under consideration, as was discussed earlier, should, for consent-based siting, the Department of Energy, at a minimum, must include state public utility commissions and other state local officials. These 2 entities are responsible for the cost and the safety of anything nuclear related within its boundary, along with other state agencies such as our own Environmental Protection Division. Another concern, since the Department of Energy has decided to move forward with a separate repository for defense waste, does this mean that it will not consider the state's input in citing the process for defense waste? As already stated before, each state must be an integral part of any process for citing nuclear waste if the state is under a consideration whether the waste is commercial or government. In short, when I would explain to a club, a civic club organization, and would look at who the audience was and try to best describe what I wanted to say to them and how what we're doing now as far as nuclear waste is concerned, I feel like that we have nuclear waste as a pinball in a pinball machine. It's bounced around, scoring points here, points there, have flippers down here to send it back up to another level, picked around, score points, but it also ends up in the receiver, only to be lifted up again and shot out and started all over. That's where we've been. That's where the circle that we've been going around for time and time again. We just need to get on with the program. We need to be very frank, very positive. There needs to be winners and losers. It's happened all. We can't be politically correct in everything that we do. We have to take responsibility. We have to take pride in what we're doing, and we have to do the job that we've been asked to do for. So, folks, Department of Energy, Congress, all of us that are participants in it, let's get together. There's common ground out there. There's common ground that if we're going to have to keep it in our pools in our states, then let us plan for that. Let us go ahead and when it comes its time to put in casting, when it comes time to put in somewhere else, let's go ahead and do that. Or if we're going to move it, let's have a transportation policy. Or if we're going to have some consent-based sightings, let's have one and let's start the program. Thank you very much.
I don't think it was alphabetical. I think I got the short straw following Commissioner McDonald as well. A little clarification. I'm not quite as eloquent as our legal expert on the panel, but a little disclaimer. I'm not from Savannah Riverside. Actually, I'm with Savannah Riverside Community Reuse Organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're one of 8 across the DOE complex. So we were set up like several were across the complex, looking at diversifying the economic base related to the Savannah Riverside. So we're designated as a reuse organization by Savannah Riverside. I have 22 bosses, 22 board members. Half of them are from Georgia and half from South Carolina. The reason being, a third of the workforce at Savannah Riverside live in Georgia but work at Savannah Riverside. And so I have a geographic focus on Columbia and Richmond counties in Georgia, as well as Aiken, Barnwell, and Allendale County in South Carolina. We've been looking at this issue for a number of years. We actually put out in 2013 a comprehensive fuel cycle study, and our position really has not changed since then till now. We had a group, some of our board members, and then also folks from other organizations in the local area participate in that study and have input to the study. And what we determined was the interim storage really is not a real viable economic engine for us to really look at. However, as discussed during John's talk, the interim, the whole process is made up of different components. And at their first meeting in D.C., one of those first components they mentioned was research and development, which we haven't heard a lot about. But it was quoted then that ultimately R&D is the foundation for all technical work and moving forward on storage, transportation, and disposal. And we believe that that's an area that we could play host to. Again, we're not interested in solely interim storage, and our governor has also expressed that same issue. And when I say that governor, that would be the South Carolina governor. Furthermore, we're in agreement with her that DOE needs to have a functional disposition plan if South Carolina is going to accept additional nuclear materials, especially for R&D, or if we host an R&D effort at Savannah Riverside. We already have, or DOE has 2 sites that has already expressed interest in interim storage. But those sites, if you know much about them, currently do not have all of the resources and capabilities to do the R&D efforts that we may have at Savannah Riverside, including Savannah River National Labs. So there's a lot of R&D that needs to be done. Some of it has been discussed, high burn-up fuel. We need to look at CAS. We need to look at transportation. All that needs to be put into this process. Does that come first? Does it go in parallel with the other process? So that's why we're here today, is to try to bring that up as an objective that needs to be talked about and DOE needs to consider. But we would also like to be part of the restrictions or incentives if we were to participate and we brought in spent nuclear fuel. Would that come from the orphan sites, or would that come from commercial utilities currently in South Carolina or possibly Georgia? And then if we were, then is the possibility to satisfy the South Carolina governor, that waste would then go out of state to the interim storage facility that would be built and processed, or will it go to Yucca Mountain or some other disposition plan? So we would have to have a disposition plan to participate in that process. We've seen problems with consent base when it's not followed. I know John doesn't like to bring these up, but we have the deep borehole, which was a research project, which kind of stopped due to the consent base. And then also his home state of Idaho has not quite followed through with some of their research studies as well, due again to consent base. So this means that a host community that's interested in participating in upfront R&D needs to do the independent analysis, education, outreach that John mentioned in his funding slide, talking about having those dollars available for communities to endeavor into those areas. So the proposed DOE grant should also be available to other communities that want to be involved in some aspect of the interim storage, but not necessarily be the host site. And that's my...
Thank you, panel members. That was great on two fronts. One, lots of substance, and we're 1 minute ahead of schedule. So I appreciate that. We're now going to move to question and answers from the audience. To any of the panel members here, we've got 2 wireless microphones roving the room here. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. I'd also like to note that for those on the web stream, we will be taking questions from you online. So submit those, and I'll get the questions forwarded up to me, and we can ask the panel members those questions. For those in the audience, as we begin the question and answer period, all I'd ask is that you would begin by identifying your name, give your name and your affiliation, if any. And again, the goal here is a conversation around issues the department should consider around consent-based siting. What do you think is important for them? How can this dialogue inform that process? And so with that, questions from the audience are now, we've got one here, and we'll give you a mic right away, and then you're second, and you'll be third.
Hi, my name is Dan Shinhofen. I'm a Nye County Commissioner. Nye County is in Nevada. We are the host county for the nation's repository by law. Nye County's been a partner with the DOE for years. Before that, we were partners with DOD, and we look forward to working with you and working through a consent-based process. But back when a plane dropped the first atomic bomb on our county and we had 1,000 tests, there was no consent. We did it because it was a national security issue. And that's what I would like us to focus on here. This is a national security issue, something that was brought up that we shouldn't rush into this. 30 years and $15 billion. We have a site. Again, moving forward with the consent for a future site, good idea. But you're starting over again, you're looking at another 30 years. So we have a site, and I'd like you to consider not ignoring us anymore. I notice on the slide that you had up there, DOE managed sites, there wasn't a dot in Nevada. We have Area 5, which is a low-level waste site, where recently our governor did sit down and talk with the Department of Energy to allow U-233-35 to be stored in our county in a 20-foot trench. But our current governor says Yucca Mountain's not safe, but that's safe. Now, back in 2002, the governor did, by law, object, and by law, it was overridden by Congress, and in 2008, the license was put forward. The NRC didn't reject it. The license was pulled back by DOE. Since then, the NRC did release the safety evaluation reports, which don't show any safety issues. So if we're going to move forward and be responsible, let's call this what it is, a national security issue. Let's finish up the project we started. Why we continue to look at consent-based moving forward. Otherwise, I think we're going to get analysis paralysis. And thank God that we didn't have a consent-based process back then, or we wouldn't have a nuclear industry now. I've got other comments. I just want to give you a hand in our comment sheets. And I don't really have any questions, except just, we did consent 4 years ago when the Blue Ribbon Commission first brought out its recommendations. And now it seems that recommendations hold more power than the weight of the law. So we have consented, and we haven't been talked to. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just, I don't know if this is on. Can you all hear me out there, one way or the other? All right, good. Thanks for that. We're not, of course, at the point where we're looking for sites or volunteers, so we haven't ruled anybody in or out at this point. With respect to the maps, just to clarify, the dots on the map show the locations of spent fuel and high-level waste storage facilities, so that's the reason you don't see Nevada. You don't see New Mexico on there either, for that reason. But certainly we've got very important operations there in New Mexico and some other states, but thanks for that.
All right, we've got one here, and just as a point of clarification, there's a public comment period at the end of this, so if you want to ask questions now, that's great, and then there's a 45 or 30-minute section at the end for also public comments to address. No worries. Thank you very much.
My name is Lou Zeller. I'm Executive Director of Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League. We have members and chapters in 6 states from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. My question, I guess, is directed towards Professor Goldstein. You mentioned about the changes in the Atomic Energy Act to remove the exemptions and allowing states to have control, perhaps under Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Clean Water Act, and other rules. Some of the states that I just rattled off are so-called Dillon Rule states. And so local control would be pretty much a non-starter in a state such as Virginia. We've run into these problems. Has anyone that you know delved into how that could work, or is it too early in the process?
Thanks, Lou. So it's to get Dillon Rule and Home Rule states really have a lot to do with whether local governments can pass specific laws or ordinances, and then whether or not the state can preempt them. What I was talking, so I think that comes into a play for sure. But what if you have Clean Water Act and RCRA authority? What that allows is, in the event of an environmental harm, the state can come in and kind of regulate. And so a good example of that is at WIP. So in 2014, there were a series of accidents. Before WIP was cited, New Mexico fought quite hard for RCRA authority. And after the accidents in 2014, New Mexico used its RCRA authority to withdraw and put a hold on the permit until the site could be cleaned up, and required the state to come in and do investigations before they would allow it to operate again. So I think that's an example of how having a federal government and a state work together using existing environmental laws is helpful. I should also say that under these environmental laws, there are citizen suit provisions, so citizens can play an active role in ensuring that the laws are enforced. Does that answer your question?
We'll get you your mic back.
Yes, partially. Thank you. Very good. But then within home rule context, you have counties where a site might be considered under this consent-based process. What would the county's role be under the home rule, as you stated, or what's also known as the Dillon Rule? Is there a possibility there?
I think there's a possibility, but I certainly think that's something that needs to be looked into. And I would say that what you'd want is very clear requirements going forward before any community consented. They would want to know what the local community's authority is, what the state's authority is, what the federal government's authority is, and how those three interact and relate, and who gets to preempt whom. I'd also say that whatever is decided upon should be ratified by Congress and signed by our president. That's one of the best ways to ensure that folks don't go back on their word. It's a lot harder to get Congress to change its mind than a single agency or a single community. So that's another kind of thing that you can build in, and that's another lesson we learned from WIP, where they had their act ratified inside.
Great. We've got one over here, and then you sir, and then over there.
My name's Karen Patterson. I'm from Aiken, South Carolina. I was trying to fly under the radar because I'm here as a private citizen, but I have to confess that I'm the chair of the South Carolina Nuclear Advisory Council. And just a point of anecdotal history, one of the slides asked, why now? Well, in the 60s, my parents had friends who worked at Los Alamos, and I remember sitting at a dining room table and hearing Dr. Davis say, the only thing wrong with nuclear energy is we don't know what to do with the waste. I was in high school, I am retired. To me, that is why now. I agree with Mindy, it needs to be deliberate and thoughtful, but slow is not part of what we need. We need to get this done. So my question is, I've been watching nuclear waste at the Savannah River site for 20-some years at this point. We have come to the conclusion that the way Congress funds EM programs is not conducive to getting these jobs done. Having to go back every year to get funding for a project that is going to take decades is counterproductive. So nobody has addressed what I think is an elephant in the room, which, as Mindy said, it's hard to get Congress to change their mind. How are we going to make, I think we need to raise this to a national, states that have waste and states that may want waste are involved. But I think the whole nation needs to be involved because, with my personal opinion, without congressional funding changes, no state is going to want to participate in this process.
Yeah, and I guess I'll start with that. Thanks, Karen. It's good to see you again. Sorry you're not under the radar, but with respect to your specific point, yes, and that's both the Blue Ribbon Commission and the administration strategy point to the need to get the Nuclear Waste Management Organization assured access to the funding that's been set aside for this purpose. I mean, I think it's been pointed out there's more than $30 billion in balance in the Nuclear Waste Fund, and being able to access that funding to make good on the federal government's responsibilities to implement this program is an essential part, I think, of a long-term durable solution to the problem.
Great. Commissioner.
I think that part of it goes back to what I was talking about. If we had a true audit of what the consumers have placed in the nuclear waste fund and why it was collected and what it's collected for, and then respond to that. But now, as far as I know, John, and you might correct me on this, it's in some bond somewhere in some drawer somewhere up in the clouds that we can't find out what it is, how much it is. And when you think about having to re-educate over and over, our political system, we have Congress, members of the U.S. House of Representatives that are elected every 2 years. We have to go through a re-education process every 2 years to get people to understand what the issue is and how important it is. And it's just passed down, the can is kicked down the road, and because there has been no concrete plan that we have X amount of dollars, and we're going to spend X amount of dollars over the next 10 years to do this, like we would do a bridge project or interstate highway project, where you know where you're going to start, and you know where you're going to end, and you know how much you're going to spend.
All right.
I'd actually like to say something about there's a couple of different questions have alluded to the fact that consent processes are slow. I'd argue the opposite. I think the reason we are where we are now is because we have not engaged in a consent process, that the kind of objections we find reemerging every time we try to cite this is because there's no national dialogue that's taken place on how, for instance, we should be doing this, what criteria should be in place before we try to do it. There has been an expediency of trying to identify a site and then try to investigate that particular site rather than figuring out what the criteria and how all that works beforehand. And so there's a hierarchy of consent that's needed, and the consent partially is about how this thing should be organized, what the process should look like, and then how it should be applied in particular situations. So, and we saw the same thing when we were starting to deal with the hazardous waste issues. I mean, there was a series of crises that erupted. There was no community in the United States that wanted to site one of these facilities. And for a shorter period of time, but it was well over 15 years, the debate was largely about how we get people to conform to the way states thought it should be. There was a number of states that had processes in place trying to preempt local control, and none of them succeeded. And it really wasn't until the dialogue became a wider dialogue around the issue about hazardous waste, not just its disposal, but also its production and how that interacted, that we finally got progress on this, and we got progress in ways that today mostly those issues are dealt with, and they're dealt with in ways that communities accept. So there's a different perspective, but it's one that says consent is really important in democratic processes to move these issues forward, and when we're talking about something as important as this, I don't see how you do it without consent.
Thank you. Rick?
Yeah, real quickly. I guess the last real DOE consent process was the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, WIP, which is in New Mexico. That took 10 years. So I understand I guess it's all relative. It's like the joke about the turtle that got mugged by the two snails, and the officer came up and said, well, what happened? He goes, well, it all happened so fast. So it's all relative to which perspective you take. I think it is a very protracted, long process, and I hope DOE does not focus so much on the process, gets into the weeds, that actually looks at what are the steps. I don't know how any host community could not sign on to a binding agreement without having some special purpose, independent organization. They're not going to sign on to DOE. We've been burned too many times in host communities. So when you look at this process, I hope, John, you and your staff go back. What are the steps? Is R&D the first step? Is the independent organization the first step? Do you need to set up incentives first in the process? Do you start the outreach and education that you mentioned earlier? We need the steps before you can actually get into the weeds of the process.
Yeah. No, and thanks for that. And that, of course, is a big part of why we're here today, is get your input as to what those steps ought to look like. To the chairman's comment, we do have an accounting of the nuclear waste fund balance. I've heard from several quarters that it's hard to find, so we're looking at ways to make it a little more readily available. We've heard that recommendation and taken it to heart, so thanks.
Does that include the interest?
Yes.
Good. Can we get that on an annual basis?
The report?
Yes.
Okay. We're trying to figure out the right way to do that, but we've heard the request. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I've got one there, then there, and then give me a second. We've got some people on the webinar who also are asking questions as well. We're going to try and find a way to include them. And if you have not typed in your webinar question yet, now is your opportunity. Sir.
Thank you. Afternoon. My name is Gary Harris. I'm Managing Director for the Center for Sustainable Communities. But I also have a nuclear background, about 30 years in nuclear energy. I've worked at some 80 facilities in this country and around the world in engineering operations, plant support, training, etc. Also wore another hat back in the day, worked for a manufacturer for nuclear fuel storage and transport. But now I'm working a little bit in the community. And I came here because I saw the connection between community engagement and community organizing and making sure communities were engaged and understood the importance of siting a nuclear facility within the boundaries of their neighborhood. So my first question is, and again, just looking at the audience here and having drove down 80 access roads to commercial nuclear facilities, I was concerned that the audience here doesn't really reflect those communities, and therefore this consent process may not have voices at the table which reflect those neighborhoods which would be affected. So my first question is all about meaningful engagement. How do we make that happen? How do we make sure that those communities are engaged in this process, that we have multiple stakeholders at the table, faith-based institutions, academic institutions, et cetera? And also, this is really all about environmental justice, and I haven't heard that term lifted up yet. So how do we ensure that there are not disproportionate impacts on lower income communities? Because a lot of these facilities will be, again, down those access roads, sited in those rural communities, lower income minority communities, et cetera. Next, how do we prevent the godfathers of the industry from turning this into a regulatory process and taking this over, i.e. IMPO, NEI, NRC, and the key suppliers, like NAC International, Kotek, et cetera? How do we prevent them from taking over this process and moving it more towards their agendas, and not what the community needs? That's a real concern of mine, And then I have several here, and then finally, there's lots of models out there for community engagement. For instance, we have the EPA here, that they have a collaborative problem-solving model. How are we looking at those success stories, and making sure that those are contained in the consent-based process? Again, hoping that this is going to be a community-driven process and not one driven by the industry.
So thanks for that. Just a couple of reactions, if I could. For starters, hearing from affected communities, of course, is extremely important. If you haven't met Kara Colton yet, Kara, raise your hand. With an outfit called the Energy Communities Alliance. It's organizations like that represent communities that host, in her case, DOE facilities that are, we talked about the range of ways we're getting input. It's meeting with groups like that help us really ensure that we don't miss those voices, because you're right, those are essential. To the environmental justice question, getting to the point where we have willing and informed hosts, right? With free and informed consent by those communities is what we're driving towards. So I don't think we use the terminology, but I think that's consistent with what you're getting at. And I'll ask the other panelists if they've got other reactions to what you just said.
Well, one of the things that I would like to say is, of course, that community is represented here in this room because I'm here. And I'm elected by people from all over the state of Georgia. And I made my wares known very well in my last election in November of 14, when I made it very pointed that I am pro-nuclear. I fared real well politically in the county where two new nuclear plants are being built today. But even though my door is open at the commission, I've got friends in this room right now that 180 degrees different from me as far as position on nuclear energy. But yet, I listen to them. They have an opportunity to come in my office anytime they want to, and they can scold me, and they have, and they can scold me when they want to scold me. But they haven't changed my mind yet. But because of the fact that I do represent the 10 million people in Georgia, that they are represented in the room.
Anything, Michael?
Yeah, I have a perspective on that. If you looked at the siting processes that emerged in the early 80s around hazardous waste treatment facility, there was a very clear pattern. And the clear pattern was, in fact, that they tended to be located in communities of color who were low income. And that was true in Georgia, that we had Taylor County was the preferred site, and where it was going to be located in Taylor County was an African-American community. So these are real issues, and they're not issues that necessarily get addressed at the level of the state, that they are embedded in communities, and those communities need to have a voice in that process. Now, the question, I think, is what does that voice look like? Because we're dealing with a national issue. We're not going to talk about a large number of these facilities, and therefore the stakes associated with each of these facilities can be quite high. And what then does the really local voice mean in that process? Because ultimately that voice cannot be activated until there's already a site being proposed, and at which point you're fairly far down the process. So I think the issue you raise is a really significant one. It's not just about hearing, it's also about responding and how that happens. And representative government is an important piece of that, but so is participatory democracy.
Mindy, or did you want to say something, Mindy, or no?
Oh, I mean,
Then
I
Rick
did,
at the
but
end, sorry.
I thought he did such a good job that I didn't have much to say, except for environmental justice obviously plays a big role, and we've been struggling as a legal community for a while to figure out how to make environmental justice claims cognizable, right? So we don't have any statutes on the books right now. We have executive orders that mandate that our government, our federal government, take these concerns into account, but those haven't been taken so well. And what we need to do better is figure out what a real voice means, how you have access to meetings, how your voice gets heard, and how we can ensure that a response is given. And we also have to decide, when does the community get to say no, and when does no mean no, right? How many times do folks have to keep getting asked? Those are all important questions that we need to think through.
Thank you, Mindy. Rick?
Not an answer, but more questions for John to go back with. What does community mean? If you look at it, what does stakeholder mean? Where does stakeholder end? So what is the host community? How large is that? Does the stakeholders include the entire state? So where do we stop with this consent base? And I know that doesn't get to the environmental justice issue, but it's something that they're going to have to wrestle with, or we're going to have to comment on and tell them what our definition of stakeholder is, or what our definition of local community is. To have consent, what does that really mean, and do you need it for the entire stakeholders? Where? Is it 2 states? Is it 1 state? So that's an issue I think that needs to be defined.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. We've got one here and then 2 in the back. Woman with the scarf first, and the second one. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Chuck Bernhard. I'm a consultant. I'm here on my own dime. I've had the pleasure of working with some of these folks before. By way of background, I was the Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce in Odessa, just south of Andrews, when WCS was being put together. Then I was the Director of the Carlsbad Department of Development. So I can claim 15 years in this area of the country where they proceeded with nuclear-based activities. I can tell you that part of the success there was education. Now, the primary driver, though, was economic development and jobs. But the people did take time to get educated, to determine, is this something we really want? And I think what they came to was, hey, there's really, the risk is lower than we thought, and here's a great opportunity. And my gosh, look at that area today. Topped off by Urenco, which is our nation's largest centrifuge facility for uranium enrichment. So just two comments. Rick, you were wrong. It wasn't 10 years, it was 11 years. So the point is, even at WIP, which was cited by the Blue Ribbon Commission as an example of a consensus-based approach, it took 11 years longer than was projected. Consent-based, I was there. It wasn't always consensus. There was a lot of pulling and tugging. And it wasn't like everybody held hands and sang Kumbaya around WIP. It was quite a challenging process. In that regard, there was another comment made, I think Mindy made it, about sustainability, transparency, etc. Any of you that know WIP know it's had problems lately. And one of them was a release back in 2014. And we're dealing with that now. And I think one of the factors behind that incident was there was a group that was overseeing the opening of WIP called the Environmental Evaluation Group, who they were a pain in the butt to us who were trying to get the site open, but they often brought up good points, and some of the improvements they suggested helped make that facility successful. Well, guess what? When WIP opened, they were gone. So there was no ongoing entity to check the operational integrity of WIP. And I would suggest that's a lesson learned, that whatever we do, there needs to be an oversight body, and whatever state, community is a host, they need to have ongoing oversight. So anyhow, this is a multi-dimensional issue. I think it's really important. It's great to see a turnout here like this. I think these panelists have all given us really good suggestions. Now the challenge is to put it into a plan for action. because we really can't wait on this issue much longer.
Thank you. I've got a woman in the scarf back there, then you, sir, you're second. Here we go.
This waste, no matter what, is intergenerational. I've had my job for 25 years. I'm Mary Olson, Nuclear Information and Resource Service. And when I started in with this stuff, there was an Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management. And that leads me to my question, because in order to participate further today, I kind of need to hear a little bit more. The office that is hosting this is clearly committed to fission, and we're not here to discuss that, but this stuff will become an ongoing fixture of our environment, our society, our roads, our communities, if nuclear future does continue as it is billed to be our future. Nuclear energy was the word I was looking for, but BRC was Blue Ribbon Commission for America's Nuclear Future. So it becomes an ongoing thing, not a one-off, right? So if we're talking in those terms, what are the next steps towards that process? I thought the BRC said we should get DOE out of this picture, and I think that's the one point that the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Atlanta, a year ago, 2 years ago, I think everybody in the room got up and cheered on that idea. So, like, what is your next steps in this picture? And I will make a comment later, but I just am kind of dumbfounded that we're here doing this right now, and I need to understand it better.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And certainly the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended that a new independent organization, single-purpose organization be set up to implement this mission. That recommendation was embraced by the administration strategy. You may remember the BRC recommended a government-chartered corporation. The administration strategy points to either a government-chartered corporation or an independent federal agency as the right way to go over the long term. The Blue Ribbon Commission report also said there are things that DOE can and should do leading up to and hopefully in anticipation of congressional action. That's what we're trying to do, which is receive input from you all on what the process ought to look like. But it still remains the administration's, the recommendation in the administration strategy that Congress act and establish an independent organization to implement this program.
Thank you. Sir? And then, you're second, and then Steve is third.
Good afternoon. Charles Utley here with the Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League. I'm from the Augusta area, across the waterways from Savannah Riverside. My question is more of a concern without a consent that would be inclusive. And what I mean by that, we can't build anything that any state would be willing to take if we're considering continue making of waste. And what are you going to do? If you know we get a state to say, okay, I'll take what you have. But then we also, through the rear, going to build, as McDonald said, 2 more new ones. Okay, you're building more. No one is going to sign a consent, and I agree with you. Environmental justice, they're not at the table. They're being told what to do. And so, yeah, we need to address that, because that is, and I spoke with the Blue Ribbon Commission, and I helped write the environmental justice bill with President Clinton. So I'm quite familiar with it. The idea is, until we have something that's permanent, that everybody can buy into, state, local, and community, then it's not going to work. Because someone said earlier, my problems are a little different from yours. I have more exposure than someone else. However, we need to do something with the problem. But we can't build on the problem if we don't have a solution to the problem. My solution to the problem is, yes, I agree. If you want it, be with it. Okay? But I want you to understand, too, make sure your community want it along with you and not just you. So that would be the main thing. So therefore, I want to say, let's do an inclusive thing. Bring everybody to the table. Everyone should know what's going on. I shouldn't have to go back and try to redeliver what should be given worldwide. It was hard. Let me just say something. It was hard for me to even find out how this meeting was going to go. And as early as this morning, I was still en route to Atlanta trying to find out the nuts and bolts. Even today, that shouldn't have happened. And what I'm saying, make it transparency. Somebody mentioned transparency. Make it transparency so we all can participate. in this structure because it depends on, and by the way, to everybody in here, I had a brand new grandbaby born this morning. I want that baby to have life and not to have to keep paying that bill.
I'm glad you said grandbaby.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. We've got one in the back, and then Mr. Nesbitt.
Hi, my name is Susan Corbett. I live in West Columbia, South Carolina. I'm here today as a spokesperson for the South Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club, which has about 5,500 members and thousands of other supporters, and I also serve on the Citizens Advisory Board for the Savannah River site. I have a couple of questions. I drove over here from Columbia this morning on some pretty bad roads. South Carolina is becoming notorious. Even our governor's gotten called out on it. But we know, and the roads look pretty good over here in Georgia, by the way, at least what I saw, so congratulations for that. But we know that we have a national crisis infrastructure-wise, roads and bridges. And we are talking about entertaining the idea of moving this waste not once but twice along bad highways, bridges, railroad links, along a lot of transportation routes. So my question is two-part. Don't we need to give some thought into putting a lot of money into improving infrastructure along the way? And shouldn't we be looking at consent for those communities that are on these transportation routes? If they're going to be passed on the sidelines as thousands and thousands of truckloads of some of the most dangerous material in the world goes by their homes and communities, shouldn't they be engaged and give consent of this waste being transported through their communities?
I guess I can start with that. I mean, the infrastructure comment I'll take as a comment. Obviously, we need to ensure that whenever we're moving materials, and it's principally by rail that we're looking at moving commercial spent fuel, just so folks know, although there may need to be some road or even barge shipment to get to railheads depending on the situation at a particular plant. As for, consent, there's no consent for the transportation element of this as there is for the siting of the storage and disposal facilities. What happens there, of course, is it's state and tribal governments that have the responsibility to plan for and train, be prepared for shipments going through their state. So to the extent that folks have concerns about, route selection or shipment inspections or emergency response training, those are the types of things that we will be working with state agencies and tribal governments on. And I encourage you to provide your comments both to us and to them as appropriate, when it pertains to the shipment aspect. Any other?
Did Chuck leave? I guess he left. He left, but one thing with the whip, I guess my mom was like the turtle, whether it was 10 years or 11 years, I guess, all relative. But one of the things whip did on their incentive, talking about infrastructure and bad roads, for whip being built in New Mexico, they actually used the incentives money to increase or have their infrastructure for road systems built. They built several new highways as related to it. So as you comment on incentives or think about consent base, what are the incentives? Is that one of them that a host community could ask for, money to go into the highway fund? Can we ask that every citizen, if South Carolina were to host one, which I said we're not interested, but if they were, would every citizen in South Carolina, and since we got Georgia right across, every citizen didn't have to pay federal income tax as long as the waste stayed in the state? I think that would generate a different consensus than having just this waste wants to come. So incentives and how you deal with incentives and infrastructure is one of those that you can talk about, but that's a big process that's going to have to be decided.
All right.
And you take one thing into consideration that it's been a proven fact, and thank you for your positive about Georgia roads, but I said earlier, if you tell people what you're going to do, and you tell people what the results is going to be, and you tell them how much it's going to cost, and then you do it, then when you get ready to do something else, people have trust and confidence. To the gentleman that wonders why we would build 2 more new nuclear plants somewhere and produce more waste, well, we go back to the federal government that we should trust. If we can't trust our federal government, who are we going to trust? We have a contract. The Department of Energy gave us a contract years ago. That would tell us where the process was going to be. Then, just like with the expansion of the ports in Savannah, that's going to impact South Carolina and Georgia, our Department of Transportation is projected $2 billion truck-only road from Macon, Georgia through Atlanta, trucks only. And that's to enhance what's going to happen at those ports down there, but it's a plan, and it's going to work.
Thank you.
I would add that, the problem with transportation is that it's very distributed, right? Depending upon where these get sited, thousands of communities could be affected in one way or another. I think that the issue of consent about the criteria for how things should be moved is a national issue. And there ought to be careful consideration of how the transportation system is designed, the storage while it's in transport, the supports for communities that might be affected as when we go along. And those things can be dealt with at a national issue, but ultimately, if you have every single community having a say about whether something can go through their community or not, ultimately, I don't see how that could possibly work.
Thank you, Michael. Steve?
Steve Hello?
You're good.
Okay. Steve Nesbitt with Duke Energy. My company operates 11 nuclear power plants, and we also have a permanently shut down plant in Florida. The plants we operate are in South Carolina and North Carolina. I've been running them since 1970. We've generated a lot of nuclear electricity, emissions free with that. I wanted to point out a couple of things, and then I got a question. We have collected from our electricity customers nearly $2.5 billion in the course of that time and turned it over to the federal government for nuclear waste management, and we have gotten nothing in return. So to the gentleman who was concerned about the nuclear industry taking over this issue, I'd say maybe that would be a good thing. With that being said, another point that came up earlier was about local control and regulation. I think there might be a misunderstanding there. Our plants do operate under Environmental Protection Agency laws and permits, and those permits are issued either by the federal government or by the state government, depending on the sharing of jurisdiction there. But it is not a situation whereby we are regulated only by the NRC. We are regulated by all applicable regulations. And that kind of gets to my question, Ms. Goldstein. So you suggested that one of the three things you talked about was changing the rules a little bit so that there would be local control through regulation. As a company that operates under that regulation, we're very concerned about what we call dual regulation, where you have multiple people telling you what to do, so you can't figure out how to do anything. But with that being said, that suspicion aside, have you or has anyone developed specific language or amendments either to the Atomic Energy Act or the Nuclear Waste Policy Act or something like that, or is that more of a concept at this point? I'm curious if there's anything more specific now.
Yeah, so a few things about all of that. So one, just to clarify, we're talking about repositories and disposal sites and not operating plants, right? So all the kind of sets of regulations are going to be slightly different depending on what context you're talking about all this in. And two, the fact that a plant can be governed both by state and federal governments working together is not unique. In fact, nuclear power is the unique kind of situation. Every other energy production source has managed to figure out the combination of the two. But as far as is there a suggestion for amending the Atomic Energy Act and the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, yes. This issue is not new, and it's gone before Congress quite a few times. I think the most recent suggestion came out in 2013. It was not drafted by me, but it's pretty good. I'd like to take credit for it. But yeah, so this idea is not new by any means. Happy to talk specifics with you maybe later. I don't think that everyone here wants to get into the super, super nitty-gritty. Or you could take one of my classes. You're welcome.
Did that answer your question, Steve? All right. I've got a question from the webinar, and I'm going to read that. Then I've got one there, and then one there, and one there, and that should probably take us to the break. All right? Are we good? From Donna Gilmore, is John Kotek aware that the existing thin 1/2-inch canisters cannot be inspected, and manufacturer Holtec says it's not feasible to repair them? SanOnofreSafety.org.
Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar with the specific concern that's being raised. I know certainly the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has rules that govern the safe storage of fuel on reactor sites. So let me commit to look into that a little bit more. I'm paying a visit out to that community here in a couple of months, and would be happy to engage on that specific technical question a little bit further down the road.
Great, thank you. Kent, I've got three. So Kent, and then the gentleman there in the blue, and then over there at the end.
Kent Cole, NAC International. NAC is one of the companies that is a provider of safe, secure, spent nuclear fuel storage and dry storage. And we're a participant with one of the organizations that's put forward a license application to the NRC to site a consolidated interim storage facility. And a couple of comments and then a question. Of course, what we're trying to do with this is one of the objectives in our timeline is aligned to try to meet the timelines in the department's strategy document to operate a consolidated interim storage pilot facility by 2021. So my first question is, how does this consent-based siting process and where we are today align with that timeline? And then the second thing really for all the panelists is this is being pursued as a private enterprise, envisioned potentially to be a privately owned and privately operated facility, and interested in comments from the panelists on how the consent-based siting process differs or applies to private facilities versus government-owned facilities from your different perspectives. Thank you.
And I'll start with the question on timing. If you pointed to the administration strategy in the 2013 date. Of course, the statement in the administration strategy is predicated on there being congressional action. On the other elements of the strategy that require change in law to move forward, we haven't seen that yet. So, you know, at the time we were thinking it would take about 8 years from the word go to get to a pilot facility, about 12 years to a larger scale consolidated storage facility. I still think those are reasonable time frames, but you know, at least based on what I'm hearing, particularly from those entities that have private initiatives that they're potentially pursuing, that they'd like to see some change in law for there to be more certainty regarding the department's ability to enter into contracts and pay for services. So I think there's still some work that needs to be done on the congressional front before we can deliver on that.
I'll take a stab at the private facility in the community. There is DOE has a stipulation in the DEER, which is a contracting mechanism called Community Commitment Plan. And I would strongly suggest any private venture that is looking at interim storage look at that in detail and actually develop a community commitment plan where some of the proceeds, in this case, a lot of the contractors will give their award fee towards workforce education, economic development, back into the community so that the private entity does not retain all of those profits, and you're actually there at being a guest of the community. So you really need to take care of the community, understand the community, and participate at the local level.
So the normal negotiations on siting are with private entities. It's actually much more rare to negotiate over a government facility. This issue, of course, because of the length of time in which the nuclear waste remains an issue, the whole question about how private corporations maintain things over time and their durability and what happens if they in fact fail is obviously something that would have to be integrated into that. I would think that the consent processes ought to be fairly parallel, that how one thinks about achieving or siting a facility with government ought to be similar to how one thinks about it in a private setting. And the issues will be somewhat different because on the one hand, government can change its mind and it's hard to bind it. On the other hand, companies aren't necessarily have the financial resources to follow through on their commitments, and so issues about the continuity and other things will become more problematic.
Great, thank you. I got 2 more questions left, 1 and then 2.
Hi, my name is Clay Chanel. I work for Southern Nuclear Company, and I am responsible for the spent nuclear fuel storage program, the dry cask program for the states of Georgia and Alabama. My question is for you, John. I have a question regarding these interim sites, both the pilot sites and the 2 proposed commercial sites. And if those were to go into effect, I think we may or may not require a change in the law for that if it were to happen without a repository. But regardless of that, if they did get shipped to an interim site, how do you view ownership of the fuel and the cost of the transportation, both to the interim site, storage at the interim sites, and then transportation to the ultimate repository? Because certainly, as someone responsible for the safety of the fuel, the safety of the public here in the states of Georgia and Alabama, and also concerned with keeping our rates and the cost of our ratepayers as low as possible, we would certainly have become key. We would want to protect our ratepayers from having liabilities and costs associated with that transport to those interim sites. And I was wanting to see your comments and where you view the DOE ownership of the fuel during that process.
Yeah, and that's an important question that we're in the process of receiving input on. Is that transport and storage paid for out of the waste fund? Is that appropriated dollars? You know, obviously, right now, as I mentioned earlier, we're paying several $100 million a year out of the judgment fund to pay for storage at sites around the country. So we see a good rationale in terms of reducing the overall burden to the taxpayers to moving forward with consolidated storage. But the specific question you asked for, we're looking for input on. So appreciate you hearing your thoughts on that.
Well, there's a kind of a simple answer to that too, is because it's like whether it's intrastate or interstate. You know, when it's interstate, you know, you can't have each state having a different policy when it's there. And so it really goes back to the concept of the federal government saying we are going to take the nuclear waste and for a permanent site. So then to do that, the best way to handle that, of course, is FOB shipping point. And then that closes from one state arguing with another state policies that you have to go through another 5 years of work. You know, put it in one source, take one responsibility, and then you got it.
Just to be clear, though, right now the policy is for the federal government to take it and dispose of it permanently. And I think that we need to be very careful in severing the storage and disposal process. And one thing we should probably take into account is if all this stuff gets consolidated, stored, and DOE takes title to all of it, where is the incentive to then dispose of it? Where are private kind of companies who generated this waste coming into play? And so I think it's an important conversation to have and a meaningful conversation to have. And I would urge us to have the conversation together with the conversation about a permanent repository.
Yeah, and one could look at parallels around hazardous waste, and the fact that you dispose of it in off-site treatment area did not, in fact, relieve you of your responsibility to make sure that was maintained safely. And anything that would look like the corporation's losing its responsibilities to maintain this thing safely would probably have lots of questions associated with it.
Thank you, Mike. We've got one more question and we're going to wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Becky Hardesty. I'm here from the public, but I've worked in the utility industry for 35 years, and I'm very pro-nuclear, so don't take this the wrong way. But I think we are kidding ourselves when we say that we're looking at this in a realistic manner. We won't let you build a house or building a school, a prison, anything without a waste disposal system, yet we continue to build these nuclear power plants without forcing them to have a nuclear disposal system. All right? We need to go back to the needs. My boss taught me a very important thing, and that's I'm up to my backside in alligators. I need you to feed the alligators. We need to push this responsibility all the way down to the consumers. The gentleman mentioned earlier about wanting to be able to do this and people having all of this stuff readily available to them at any given point in time. You flip a switch, the power comes on. Why? Because we have a nuclear power plant that's supplying that. In World War II, we did this testing because we had a need. We have a need. We have more gadgets now than any one person can carry in their pocket at any given point in time. They all run on electricity. If you can't supply the electricity, they don't get their iPods, they don't get their iPads. It goes all the way down to the children of these people who want this technology, but they don't want to pay for or develop or store nuclear waste. You can't have it both ways. And I think it's very important to us to educate that, push those alligators all the way down to the bottom level. Your kids want this, you have to address it. If you want this, we have to address it. But let that need feed all the way up from the community up through us and get the community involved in how we do it. We have a lot of very highly educated people here today, but I can guarantee that, as the gentleman over here mentioned, a lot of these people aren't being heard. They don't have web access. They don't have phone access in their areas, and we're making decisions for them. We've got to get community groups together. We need to have town hall meetings. We need to get the customers educated in what it is they're asking for, not just from an electric level, but also from how do you deal with the waste that goes along with that? How are we going to address getting that amount of community involvement and get that need pushed up? If you don't approve those development plans for nuclear power plants, I guarantee those construction companies are going to be throwing a holy rolling fit. They want to build their nuclear power plant, but without that approval for a waste disposal system, how are you going to do it? One of the communities I lived in Illinois, you don't build a school, you don't build a subdivision without having the infrastructure behind it. Yet we're letting these big companies, nothing against Duke, work with you all the time. But how do we continue to build these plants without having the infrastructure underneath it to support it?
Thank you very much.
Jim, I want to touch on that just briefly.
20 seconds.
20 seconds. You have to realize that there is a law currently that has been on the books that has a repository. It's called Yucca Mountain. So don't put this all on the utilities that say this there. They've got to come up with a disposal mechanism that has been already decided. It's been acted on by Congress, but now we have rescinded that. We're in a community where we have 8,000 canisters of vitrified waste that was supposed to go to Yucca Mountain, could go to Yucca Mountain, could go tomorrow. But because our government has decided Yucca Mountain now is no longer viable, that is the disposal method. We have it already. We need to act on the law and make Yucca Mountain go ahead and open it up, and we can have interim storage and Yucca Mountain. There's no reason you could not have both. So it's a disservice to say there's not a mechanism in place. There is.
All right. Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you, audience members. Thank you, panel members, for your excellent presentations today. Come a round of applause for them, please. Okay, we're now headed into the break. I need you for 2 minutes so I can give you a little bit of a foreshadow of what happens. Is there going to be a slide up here with that right now? So before we go to the break, we're going to break for 15 minutes. We're going to come back for some small group discussions. Give me 2 minutes to walk through this, please. When you come back, and this is sort of the meat of the meeting here, you're going to self-select around tables, 8 to 10, 10 to 12 people. The goal of this discussion is for you to collectively dig deeper on the issues you've heard about this afternoon. Each table has an independent third-party facilitator, and their job is to help you have a productive conversation. Can I ask those facilitators to identify themselves? Raise your hand. So when you come back from your coffee break, they'll be there with little chart paper and stuff ready to have a conversation or help you have a conversation. There are no prescribed topics for this discussion, but in your packet is a piece of paper with some guiding themes and ideas to help kickstart that conversation. At the end of that 1 hour period, there's going to be a report back session summarizing the small group discussions. These will then be condensed into a summary report of this meeting. Our Chicago meeting 2 weeks ago, the summary report is going to be posted on the department's website this week. So we're going to maintain a level of transparency and dialogue and feedback. And from the webinar, for those on the webinar, we learned that live feeds of small group discussions does not make for good television. So we're going to pause the live stream until we come back to the report out session following the small group discussions. So it is 2:56 now. We're going to be back here at 3:15 sharp. We're going to start on time, and the live webcast will start in 75 minutes from now, Eastern Daylight Time. Anything else I need to raise right now? If not, 15 minutes back. Thank you very much for your time.